Okay, so we're looking at the theory of anaphora or the treatment of anaphora in what is known as binding theory within generative grammar. And what we're going to do is look at this and go into some more depth in this, look at it from the perspective of how it has to work across languages by looking in particular at how it would work for Norwegian. And Norwegian, the facts I'm going to go over there with respect to Norwegian are the facts discussed in the textbook. The important thing to keep in mind is that there are differences across languages. So languages will have pronouns and ordinary and reflexive pronouns, but the ways in which they work will be different, and they can have a wider variety of different kinds than English has. English has a really relatively constrained inventory of these things. Okay, so the key things that we have to keep in mind are the notion of argument and the notion of semantic argument as one subtype of that. So it's common to speak of the arguments in a tree as being syntactic. That's a syntactic object. An argument so syntactic arguments are things that are there because of the semantics and that occupy the typical spots in the tree that arguments are meant to go in. So the tree structures are showing in some sense what the semantics are, because the places in the trees are often determined by elements from the semantics. So here we're showing both the lexical conceptual structure and the syntactic structure. Okay, and so we have in this sort of a structure like this, where we have an infinitival clause as the embedded clause, we have a verb like that is part of a larger structure, a lexical structure, would like, that has a particular meaning, and that the verb like here has an infinitival complement with a to-head. So we see that to-head, we know it's and so the infinitival structure refers to that, so an infinitival clause would be that combination of things, the to and a VP embedded underneath it. Okay, so in this situation, we know that if we take here, what I've added here from the discussion last time is an adjunct PP. So we're going to look at that. How does that work? How does that make a difference? So we could have Wilma would like Fred to skin a cat. If we have it like that, we could have Wilma would like Fred to hug her. Right? That would be fine, but not hug herself, because binding theory would rule out herself going with Wilma, right? Wilma would like Fred to kick himself, would be okay, right? Because Fred controls the pro. Because Fred is a co-argument semantically as well as syntactically with the object of that VP, the embedded VP, right? Okay, but we could also have Wilma would like herself to skin a cat, would be fine, remember? So that would be okay, because Wilma and Fred are syntactic co-arguments, and that would be a scenario in which you would get reflexive anaphora. But in this case, Barney is not an argument of the verb, right? Because you could add, one of these beneficiary PPs onto any clause, right? Pretty much. If there's an action that's being done, it could be done for someone, right? Always, that's a possibility. So this is an adjunct PP. And what that means is that Barney doesn't have any co-arguments, right? So it cannot be bound by a co-argument. So what do we get here? It's not okay to put a pro here, right? So this can't be, you can't have control. You can't just say, Wilma would like Fred to, you notice that you could say, Wilma would like to skin a cat for Barney, right? That would be fine, where we leave off the subject of the embedded infinitival phrase. That would be a pro there, right? But pro can only go in that slot. It can only be the subject of or that's the hypothesis. So we wouldn't be able to get it here, right? You couldn't just leave off that argument and have it be interpreted as, well, it gets its value from Wilma, right? Not a possibility. So, but what if we put a pronoun in there, right? So if we put her in there, is this okay? Wilma would like Fred to skin a cat for her. That's okay, right? We would expect that. That would be okay because it's not, that her wouldn't be bound by anything, right? It wouldn't be bound by there's no co-argument it's not being bound by a co-argument, whatever's going on there, right? Because the hypothesis is it doesn't have a co-argument. Would it be okay to have, how about here, for Fred to skin a cat for him? For Fred to skin a cat for him. Is that okay? Where him goes with Fred? It's not bad like some of these other cases, right? And it seems like that would be okay. It would be all right to do that. But it might not be your preferred thing to do, right? But it doesn't have, right? It's not like if you had said, Wilma would like Fred to skin him, where him tries to go with Fred. Absolutely impossible, right? But in this case, it's a different scenario. And we know we could do things like, I did that for me. Would be fine, right? I did that for myself. That's fine too, right? Because when we put something that's in an adjunct phrase like that, it's in a different scenario, right? Whereas I couldn't say, I wouldn't say I shaved me this morning, right? I shaved, or I looked at me in the mirror this morning is weird, right? Whereas I looked at myself, and that you kind of need that, right? So there's something funny going on here where adjuncts behave differently. And so we need to have an account of that. So that's okay with himself, is perfectly fine here as well, right? But then that's not a co-argument, we're saying, right? So how could that be okay? So how could it, first of all, be okay to have a pronoun? Well, it's okay to have, you would expect you would be able to get a pronoun, because pronouns just can't be bound by a co-argument, right? But why is it that you can get a reflexive, and why is the reflexive preferable here, is sort of what the question is, right? So what we need to do is have something big, some other constraint. It's not enough. The theory is not enough to account for these facts. And so there's another, so as an attempt here, we could say, how about this? A reflexive pronoun with no co-arguments wants the closest subject as its antecedent. That would work, right? So I want a subject then, right? And so here we can have himself go with Fred. Perfectly fine because it's got a subject, right? And that's sort of, we know that's going to be one of the constraints in general in languages. I'm a reflexive anaphor. I'm going to want a subject in general. And in some languages, it's got to be that way no matter what. So that's one thing we can do. And then we can, but with that, we can account for why herself wouldn't be good here, right? I guess, right? Elma would like for Fred to skin a cat for herself. No, that's bad, right? Because why? Because, oh no, Fred, it's got to go with Fred, right? It's got to find the closest thing. You got to find a subject that's close enough. But all of these things are hard, right? Because we're getting into areas of the grammar that are complex and difficult, and we're looking at stuff like this. Now we'll go to something else. Wilma would like Fred to write a story about Barney. And write would be something, would have an LCS, something like that. A story about Barney, that whole thing would be an argument of right, but it would be, so what would be co-arguments? A story about Barney would be a co-argument, a syntactic and semantic co-argument with Fred, right? Is that right? And what we want to look at here is what the internal structure of that story about Barney is, would be something like this, and we've got here about DP would be an argument of story, right? Story is something for which there is, a story is describing an act of communication of some kind, right? It's a text that communicates something. And stories are always about something. So presumably that PP that goes with story is a complement of story. Everything about this structure suggests that that's what the situation is. So the DP down inside of there would be one without any co-arguments, because the co-argument domain that we're looking for here is the noun story, and there's nothing else in that domain, right? Okay, so that's and the reason we're looking at these is because this is a classic problem. These kinds of DPs poses a classic problem for any theory of anaphora, because of the kinds of things that you can get in these situations. So Wilma would like Fred to write a story about herself. Wilma would like Fred to write a story about herself. Actually, it's not that bad, right? But it's not okay. Some people are saying not okay, right? Anybody say it's good? It's okay? Anybody think it's okay to do it this way? Put herself there? Goes with Wilma? No. But it may be not as bad as some other things, and we'll see why. But how about would like Fred to write a story about himself? That's fine, right? Okay, so that is accounted for by a reflexive pronoun with no co-arguments wants the closest subject as its antecedent. And now, but this is really, sort of important, right? That's evidence that Fred is a subject, right? So this construction actually makes a lot of sense, right? Remember we said, well, Fred is kind of like the object of like, but it's also like the subject it's also a subject at some level no matter what we do, right? And we can have it be that it's a subject of the embedded clause, but then it raises in and becomes the object of the higher clause. That's a possible analysis of this structure, but even then, we have an account of this, right? Because the trace of Fred, if it raised to be the object of like, would be the closest subject, right? And anything in your trace, you're the same thing. So we have an account of this that makes sense. Would like Fred to write a story about him. Would like Fred to write a story about him. It seems like it's okay, right? That's what we predict, right? Him and himself. So we're looking at cases where it's him and himself. The reflexive and ordinary pronoun aren't really in complementary distribution. They can both go in the same slot. We might prefer himself here, right? But him seems to be okay to me anyway. I mean, it seems like this is a case that works, right? Well, it can be referring to someone else, and so you would, but I think it's fine to have it go with Fred, isn't it? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think people would have differences about this. Because himself is a possibility here, I think that would be the preference, right? But you find things like this, and that's, I think people have different takes on that. And to me, it seems fine. Okay. But if we do this, we get a completely different scenario if we put Betty's story about Barney, right? Now we're going to have this is going to create So we'll do this with change rather than write. Because write a story actually creates a scenario that would help favor a reflexive in that sort of situation. Because the writer of the story might even be interpreted as part of the argument structure of story, right? So we get right out of there and we put change in here. That's gonna give us a different scenario. And then we put something that is the subject of that DP. So Betty's story about Barney, we now have a situation where him is perfectly fine here with Fred, right? Wilma would like Fred to change Betty's story about him, where him goes with no problem whatsoever, right? And the reason that that's going to be so is that we've now made a scenario in which the thing in the slot. Now, notice in these diagrams what I'm doing here is putting an arrow, a solid arrow, down to the thing that I want you to imagine the pronoun or reflexive going into. And the green dotted arrow is showing what we want it to be interpreted with. And I'm also showing that with the indices. So we have the indices on that DP that's embedded down in there be the same, right? So that then that's actually the only possibility, right? Himself is no longer even possible here, right? Wilma would like Fred, right? So notice what the key thing here is that abstracting away from the difference between change and write, which I said could be relevant to some extent, putting in that Betty's inside of that DP, Betty's story about, because notice if you think about it, what is that doing? If you talk about Betty's story about someone, then you're introducing for story the argument of the producer of the story, right? The argument that is the producer. So a story is going to have, in fact, two semantic arguments at some level, right? There's going to be producer and thing produced. I don't know that you would want to say there's a recipient semantic argument, but it is a kind of communicative thing, and so you might have something in there in the semantics, but what comes out in the syntax is important because the things that are expressed in the syntax, the arguments, the semantic arguments that are expressed, are what are generally going to be relevant for all of this stuff. So himself is impossible here, and herself is fine, right? Yeah.
Are we going to find a scenario where the pronouns are mutually distributed?
Are what?
Are mutually distributed such
where there are places where they're equally good choices?
Well, such that the preferred
one. Well, yeah, I mean, there are the preferred one under what set of circumstances is the question, right?
I'm just wondering if we can put like a dominant.
Yeah. If you can, I think this might be a possibility, right? If given the possibility of using the reflexive, prefer that, right? Is what you're saying. Yeah, I think that might be what was at play in that earlier example. Although I think that you really have to have all of the semantics and pragmatics and everything about this in play and understood in order to really say what's the preferred option. And so I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. But that, in general, I think that would probably work. But this is a complex and interesting problem that people have been working on for a long time, and new things about this come out. I'm actually taking you though fairly deep into this because it's an interesting problem. Okay. Why did I make it switch like that? I don't know. Whatever. So these are co-arguments, right? Story about here we're going to look at. I see what I did. I'm going to a completely different structure, right? I'm going to one with an embedded CP. So let's look through that scenario. We're kind of going at this backwards in a way. The first versions of binding theory started out looking at this scenario, not the one with all of with the infinitives and all of that kind of stuff. That's why, as I said before, the earliest versions of binding theory were stated in terms of clause mates. So if you're clause mate with something else, then you should be reflexive, not pronoun, if it's your antecedent and so forth. Because it started looking at these kinds of structures where there were embedded CPs, and then so very clearly two separate clauses. Okay, so Wilma knows that, if we just take the ordinary situation, Wilma knows that Betty likes Barney. Wilma knows that Betty likes herself. The herself would have to go with Betty, not Wilma, right? Betty knows that Fred likes herself. Absolutely ungrammatical, because there's no feminine thing that's within the domain that can possibly be the antecedent, right? Okay, now if we take so it's in general the embedded clause in this kind of structure where you have a tensed verb and a CP, that's going to create a domain in which all of the stuff has to happen in general, right? That's where if you have a subject and an object, the object is reflexive, has to go with the subject. If you have and whenever you have co-arguments in that embedded clause, that's going to be the domain for any sort of, for the determination of the binding constraints. But when we start to put in structures like this with a story and about and so forth, and we put in these kinds of determiner phrases, then it creates interesting scenarios. And the ones that have given rise to a lot of the work in trying to state the exact constraints on binding theory. So here we have a story like that about Barney would be a co-argument with Betty here, right? Betty is the object of the verb hurt. The subject of the verb hurt is a story like that about Barney. And so we make some predictions here, right? The binding theory, as we've got it, says that that Betty, the thing in the Betty slot, should that be able to be bound by Wilma? The thing in the Betty slot. Wilma knows that a story like that about Barney could hurt her or herself. Is the question, right? Her, right? But again, herself isn't all that bad, right? And it could, in some cases, it would work here. But here, the interesting thing, in some sense, is this, right? Can we have a story like that about her could hurt Betty? Is that okay? That's fine, right? How about here? Well, that's okay, right? Her is fine. Herself, not okay, but not all that bad. I mean, it's not as bad as some of the other ones, right? But I guess we'd say not okay, right? We wouldn't want herself here. The reason is that there's a closer subject, right? That would be because a story like that about Barney is a subject in that clause, right? And so there is a closer subject, you want that. But even though, I guess it's just that the subject can't itself possibly be an antecedent here, right? And so, well, herself maybe isn't all that bad, but it's pretty bad. But here, this is the interesting one, right? That herself seems to be fine here, right? A story like that about herself could hurt Betty. Wilma knows that a story like that about herself could hurt Betty. Seems to be okay to put herself there and go with Betty, right? But her would go there as equally well, right? So the story basically is going to be that you're going to have to, and we'll see this in other cases, you have to go to something else here. You have, because Barney and the thing the DP in the place of Barney in that structure and where we're putting herself in here, that's not a co-argument with Betty under any semantic co-argument, right? It can't be. It's not a syntactic co-argument either, because the syntactic co-argument domain for that embedded DP is the DP itself. And so you get herself here for a different reason. And what we could say is, and right, there's no subject antecedent here. Because Betty is clearly not a subject, right? But the observation that people have made about these kinds of things is that they talk about it in terms of empathy reflexives or something like that, where what's going on here is Wilma's talking to you about the consciousness of someone else. And the consciousness of people is going to be at play here for reflexives in situations where the reflexives don't have some other natural binder. They're going to look for a subject, and a subject is usually referring to someone whose point of view is at issue. That's a very common sort of scenario. So even here we have Wilma knows, we're talking about Wilma's point of view. But we're talking about Wilma's point of view where she's thinking about Betty's point of view, because how else would she know whether there's hurt or not? So Betty's state of mind or consciousness comes into play here. So it's a complicated story, right? But that's what I'm saying, that in order to have a story for all of this, you really have to have you have to be taking into account the whole semantic and pragmatic scenario. And so that's what the story has been, basically, is that you could say that Betty's point of view is at issue here, where point of view is a very broad sort of term. That is her consciousness with respect to the content that you're talking about. But then, you would think that given this set of constraints, that Wilma should be okay too, right? Because Wilma is the closest subject, right? And Wilma's also got her point of view there, right? And so that's why, it does not seem that bad to put herself going with Wilma, right? That's all I'm saying, that but there's something about closeness that's still going on here that has to be taken into account, and Betty is closer, so this is a dilemma, a potential dilemma for any theory of anaphora, because you've got something that's not a subject. Oh, here, that I said. Herself is question marks, right? You would predict that it would be okay, all else being equal, but there's other stuff going on here. You want the closest thing that is like an argument. Okay, so then we'll go to even some harder cases, right? So it seems to Wilma that a story like that about Barney could be a very bad thing. So what we're doing here is taking out all of the subjects altogether, right? There are no subjects here other than it. And it can't possibly, the dummy it in this construct, right? So we're constructing it in a way, we're saying, well, let's get rid of the distracting features. Like we said, well, we want a subject, but is that really what's critical? And we're predicting that it's not what's critical, because we're saying that point of view is at issue here, right? Well, the point of view that's at issue can be a factor in this, right? So we know also that that Barney is not a co-argument with anything else here, right? Because it's just sitting there. There are no, except for maybe the writer of the story, but the writer of the story is not even being expressed here, right? There's no, who's being expressed? Just Wilma. Wilma's the only possible human antecedent for anything here. And so we've got, Wilma is is one of the arguments of seams, right? So seams can have an experiencer argument. And notice what you're really saying. If you use seams, you're saying Wilma thinks that, apparently, right? Or something like that. That's what seams means, right? You're talking about, seams is giving you a scenario on a scene. It's a very good verb. What it does is gives you someone's point of view is what it's giving you, right? And here we're specifying whose point of view we've got in mind. So it's basically, this is interesting, it seems to say, it's the point of view of someone that, right? That's what it means at some level. Where point of view is kind of an abstract term, but it has to do with how a scene is being envisaged, right? And the person that's doing it with seems is the one that's specified by the to phrase. Okay, so we have, it seems to Wilma that a story like that about Barney could be a very bad thing. It seems to Wilma that a story like that about herself could be a very bad thing. Seems fine, right? Because, why? Because it's not co-arguments that we're worried about. And it's also not subjects. So there's this sort of really good evidence that it's not about subjecthood. It's not about being co-arguments necessarily, right? So when there is no co-argument, you go to a different strategy, and it's okay to use reflexives, and you want to use reflexive in scenarios where you very clearly have someone's point of view on a scenario in mind, right? And so that's what's happening here. Okay, so we have more than just the syntactic structure. And then if you have this, it must have seemed like a story like that about Barney could be a very bad thing, which would also be fine, right? It's a perfectly fine sentence. And then you put as background context, you've got a conversation going, right? And you say, well, why would Wilma have done that? It must have seemed. And then I'm not going to say it must have seemed to her, right? That's the default interpretation here, right? I'm talking about, I've already set it up that I'm talking about Wilma's point of view on the whole thing, right? It's very interesting, right? Because it turns out that although lots and lots of work has focused on the syntactic structure and its relevance for reflexive anaphora in particular, there's other stuff going on. You don't have to have the thing that determines the possibility of a reflexive. Is here herself is getting its value from whoever the seamer to is, right? If you could say that, you can't really say it, but we know who that is, right? It's that argument of seems that in this case is implicit. It's implicit in the structure. You have to go to the context, the discourse context, to unpack that. So the whole, that's what it said, the whole scenario, the whole discourse in which the sentences are embedded has to be taken into account in order to understand what's possible. And so herself is fine here, right? But I guess we should also be able to get her, right? Her wouldn't be a problem. It seems to her, right? Her would have been okay there as well. But that's okay because it's not, her wouldn't have been bound by anything. Okay, you've got the picture, right? I don't know which one would be preferred there. I mean, would your theory about if you can use a reflexive, use it? Would that work? Because it's not clear. Right? It seems like they both work fine, right? But so then what really it is if I choose to use the reflexive there, in a situation where there isn't a syntactic structure that would determine the antecedent, then I'm giving you the information that I want you to keep in mind that I'm talking about someone's point of view. Right? You're focusing on that empathy aspect that the reflexive stuff does. So you get, at some level, a different meaning, right, than if you use just the ordinary pronoun. The ordinary pronoun is just vague with respect to all of that. Okay, so if we look at, now Norwegian is interesting, and it's been one of the famous cases to look at because it has so many different kinds of things. And there are other languages that do as well, that will have, is that thing a reflexive pronoun or is it an ordinary pronoun? What is it, right? Because languages will have 4 or 5 different things that you. And Norwegian's also kind of easy to do because it's cognate with it's a language that is related to English, and so you'll see that the pronouns and reflexive forms are cognate with English. And so here we have two. So we have we're just taking a really ordinary little clause, right? There's a subject, there's an object, and you've got one possibility is seg selv, which is kind of like himself, except that the seg part is not gender specific. The seg part is, and we can't put a gloss there because there's nothing like it in English, right? What would you call it, right? It's sort of like self, right? Or something like that. So self would just look stupid. So we say, well, we don't know what it is. We'll call it seg. This is what the author did, of the author of the Norwegian story that did the binding theory in Norwegian. Lars Helen, I believe, was the name of the person that did this. Just put seg there. But actually, if you go back and you look at self in English, well, what's the history of this? Where did it come from? Why do we use self? Now, we know we can use it as an ordinary noun now. But if you go back in the history of English, you find that you can go back across all of, like in Norwegian and all the Germanic languages have some version of this. So it goes way back. And it goes way back to someplace pre-Germanic and Indo-European that we can't reconstruct. We don't know for sure. But one theory is that it is a compound form, and this sort of makes sense, right? Remember we were looking at Portuguese has the reflexive, and the same would be true of Spanish and French and Italian. What do they have for reflexives usually? They have this say or see little thing that goes on front of the verb, right? Well, one theory is that self is a compound form of that, plus something else that we don't know what it is, right? We can't, that hasn't been reconstructed. But that makes some sense, right? Because we know that there must have been something that say in Spanish and Portuguese and Italian must have come from somewhere, right? And it must have come from somewhere in Indo-European because you find it across all of the Romance languages, right? So that's a plausible story, but we don't know for sure. And then what is the seg? The seg is seg too, right? Because that etymologically. So etymologically, it's self, if you will. Self in Old English was and could be used just like an adjective to mean so within English. It was used as an adjective, like you could say stuff like the self person, which would mean the very person that or the same person. So it just meant same. But it can make sense, right? Same would work into a reflexive construction in a very nice, easy way, right? Okay, so that's just some background on Norwegian. Now we can put seg selv here. So notice that this is not gender-specific, seg selv. It just means oneself or something like that, right? I guess. I don't know, whatever. I mean. But so we put seg selv here. That would be the case where we have subject-object. The object is going to be in that form. And we cannot put just seg here. Not okay. John admires self, or just seg. I mean, sometimes seg will show up all by itself, okay? But not here. Can't do it here. And, yeah. Okay, seg self, okay. Seg, not okay. Ham, not okay. Ham, of course, is cognate with him, right? So that's not surprising. But you can also not put himself. So what really is cognate with himself can't go here in Norwegian. So that's kind of interesting. Only seg self, not himself. So we've got a whole different sort of problem. So John talked about married. Now we put a PP, so we're just changing things around a bit and see how it works, right? And you don't know what's going to happen. You have to test these things. Himself, not okay. John talked about himself, not okay. Seg self, okay. So that's sort of like what happened before. Seg, not okay. Not okay either, right? So in that sort of situation, we have an argument in a prepositional phrase, then that's just the same as if it were the subject and direct object. We need, in that situation, we've got a single clause, a complement, a subject. We need to have seg self in that scenario, right? The subject, seg self goes with the subject, and no other possibility is there, including ham self, not possible. But if we put in a situation like this is where we get a different scenario. So we put John spoke with whatever, however you want to translate this. It's technically, it would be talked with Mari, whatever that word. I don't know these Norwegian names. I don't know Norwegian, but I know it enough. I know Germanic well enough to know that the med preposition is semantically the same as with. Old English used to have a preposition like that, and it disappeared, and with came in and took over. So that's the Germanic with. And then we've got about Ariel. So John spoke with would be probably a more idiomatic translation, right? Marik about Ariel. Okay, so what can we put here? Here, now all of a sudden himself looks fine, right? So John talked with Marik about himself. That's okay now, right? So the himself has a purpose, but it's not the same purpose as himself in English. And seg self is not okay here. So remember, if John talked about seg self is fine with John going with seg self, but John talked with Mari about seg self, no, not okay. Because so basically you're getting a set of choices that is highly restricted. Which one you use depends on the exact syntactic structure. I mean, the semantics is relevant as well because you have to know what are arguments and all of that, but the syntactic structure is doing much of the work. So here again, we cannot put seg here. Not okay. Only one possibility is himself. Okay, you got the picture, right? So there's a case where seg self. So what's the difference? What would you say the constraint is here? Ham self and seg self have to be, or what kinds of things? They're reflexive things, right? Because they want a close by antecedent, right? And the difference is? So remember, so John talked about seg self, fine. John kicked seg self, fine. Only possibility. John talked about seg self, John kicked seg self, John whatever, right? Subject, object, subject, complement. And John talked to Marik, spoke with Marik about himself, has to be himself, cannot be seg self, cannot be any of the others, right? So the difference between seg self and himself is what? Huh? No, it isn't the fact that that's a prepositional phrase, because if I said John talked about seg self, that's fine, right? John going with seg self, right? John talked with Marik about seg self. Well, I don't know, that might be okay, but it's not with Marik. Cannot go with Marik. Then you have a different, you have to, for that about phrase, the antecedent has to be one thing if it's trying to go with the subject and another thing if it's trying to go with something else. So that's all it is, right? Is that so the binding theory Norwegian is Ham and Seg. So I'm looking forward ahead a little bit here. Ham cannot have a coargument antecedent. So Ham is like a pronoun, right? I can't have an antecedent. I'm not okay if I have an antecedent in the same clause. But that's going to be true of Seg as well. Ham-self and Seg-self must have a coargument antecedent. So they're like, it's like you've got, okay, so here's the situation. You can boil it down to this. English has one kind of thing for both of these scenarios. I'm a pronoun, ordinary pronoun, can't have a coargument as an antecedent. Where coargument we're thinking of as being still that same broad concept, syntactic or semantic. And then there's the kind of reflexive thing, and those kinds of things have to have, in general, a coargument antecedent, right? But Norwegian has two kinds of each of those things. One kind that is gender-specific in both categories, but the gender specificity is irrelevant for the general theory. What's relevant is other things. And like in many languages, the ham-self, well, like in many languages, whether or not the antecedent is a subject is critical. It's an important part of the theory. And so it's important to understand all of these things if we're looking at other languages, because then it's this kind of thing that one would look at in order to provide evidence for what's the subject in a particular clause in a particular language, right? Because we know that these kinds of phenomena, anaphora, are often sensitive to presence or absence of a subject. And it's important in English as well, right? But in Norwegian, it's way more important. So Seg-self must have a subject antecedent. Ham-self cannot have a subject antecedent. So then we get this complementary distribution, right? Where I haven't said what Ham and Seg, what the constraints on them are pretty hairy, right? But they're pronoun type things, actually, more so than anything else. And the others are reflexive type things, okay? So you're with me here so far, right? Sort of, at least. So Ham is not okay. Spoke with Mari about Arna. Didn't I just do this? I just did this, right? Okay. Now, if we do something with, we have to look at embedded infinitival clauses to see how it all works. So again, it's really important. It's going to turn out to be a critical matter in Norwegian, whether you've got, kind of like it is in English, right? If you have an infinitival complement clause versus when you don't, you get different scenarios. So that's going to be the one factor is, are we co-arguments or not? If we're co-arguments, is our antecedent subject or not? We have to make, so there's a bunch of parameters you have to take into account. If we're in an embedded clause and we're trying to take something higher up as our antecedent, then we have to take into account, the simple story is we have to take into account whether we're an infinitival clause or not, as opposed to a tense clause. And these are things that you would find in lots of languages. So okay, now all of a sudden we know we know that Ham can show up here. This is fine. So John asked Mari to kick him. Now, because it's not like English, right? You have to remember it's not like English here. We have a control structure here, an object control structure. Asked Mari. Mari is an argument of ask, and the embedded infinitive is going to be the clause having to do with the proposition that's being asked of Mark, the event structure that's being asked of Mark to participate in. And then Mari, and there's going to be a pro in the embedded infinitival clause, right? And so the examples there show you the different possibilities, but basically here we have ham, and that's because and ham is here okay as well, right? Because it's not really caring about subject versus object anymore. All it's caring about is the infinitival nature of it, in part. That's going to be part of the story. But seg is here okay here as well. So ham and seg can both go here. But seg cannot go with the object. So, right, so that's kind of a complicated scenario, right? So ham and seg both say, well, I want to find something outside of my clause. And ham is saying, well, I don't care, give me anything outside of that clause, right? If I'm in an infinitival structure. And seg is saying, what is seg saying? It's saying, I don't want an object. I want a subject, no matter what, right? So you have this subject versus object working here. So seg must have a subject antecedent, has to be outside of the clause that it's in, that it's contained in, and but it has to be a subject, right? And then, so then we take a tense clause situation, right? So the tense clause situation is different. John thinks that Marit is smart. John thinks that seg is smart, not okay, right? John thinks that Han is smart, fine, right? So the other constraint is that seg must have a subject antecedent that is contained in the same minimal tensed IP. So what that's saying is that seg will go and look for a subject antecedent, but it has to find it within a certain domain. And what is the domain that it has to find it in? It has to look up and find a tensed IP. And the lowest one, so the same minimal one means the lowest one that I find. So that allows me to look out, if I'm seg, I can look outside of an infinitival clause, and then I need to find the subject that's the subject of a tensed clause above that, the closest one above that. So it's weird, right? But nevertheless, you get this whole grammar of reflexives and pronouns in Norwegian that is subject to the syntactic structures that you put them. Whether or not it's a clause, whether or not if you're clause mates, whether or not you're co-arguments, whether or not you're in an infinitival clause, and then whether or not your potential antecedent is a subject or not. So here you can see we've got seg inside, and then the first sentence there. John asked us to try to get you to talk nicely about. Notice that we've got look at what the structure of that is, right? It's John asked us, and then there's an embedded infinitival clause for us to try to, right, where there's a pro, to ask us, to get you to talk nicely about him. So we've got two embedded infinitives, one inside of the other, both of them serving together as the complement of asked, right? It's a control structure. We can put seg in there, and that's fine. And seg, in that case, goes with John. way up in the clause, right? It just looks way up the clause structure, saying, give me a tensed IP. Give me an IP that has a tensed verb. The infinitival verbs don't count. I just look right past them. I go up the tree looking for something. I've got to find an antecedent in that tree. And that antecedent has to be a subject and something contained in tensed IP, right? So it's kind of hairy, right? So this is a case of where seg is a long distance reflexive. It's a reflexive that doesn't have any problem looking up higher in the clause, which is something that you find in lots of other languages. Chinese has a set of pronominal reflexive things that is as complex as Norwegian, and one of them is a thing just like seg. So that's something that you find in lots of languages. And here, we can get John looked behind him. We get Ham. And that's fine with Ham going with John. John likes his car is not okay. And now we have a problem, right? Oh, no, these are both not okay, right? Because they're in the same clause, right? They've got... Did I get this wrong? Why did I put this on here? I don't remember. Skip it. Okay. I don't remember what happened there. The Norwegian stuff is hairy. What's interesting about it is that it has that array of different things, and they're sensitive to syntactic properties of the trees. Okay, so what I want to do now is to restate the binding theory in terms of the things that you find in the literature most often. So binding theory is usually spoken about in terms of two principles, one having to do with reflexives and one having to do with ordinary pronouns. And the one having to do with reflexives is called principle A, and the one having to do with ordinary pronouns is called principle B. And this goes back to a proposal about these things from Noam Chomsky, of course, like everything does, in the 1980s, early 1980s, where he made up the term binding theory. So he made up the term binding theory, and then people started using that to talk about these constraints. And as I said, the syntactic theory has largely revolved around this problem, this set of problems that we're looking at. Because syntactic theory, the tree structures that people started drawing very early on were drawn in such a way that they would be able to account for reflexive and pronominal anaphora in English. And so what I'm going to do now is just take you through this version of the theory stated in terms of these two principles, and then I'm going to contrast that version of the theory with another version, and this is just following what the textbook does, right? Because the textbook says, okay, here's standard classic binding theory, here's co-argument binding theory. Either one can be used, they make different predictions, they differ in certain ways. Those are two hypotheses. There are different hypotheses about how binding theory should be fleshed out. We've looked at some of the facts, how you would do them in co-argument binding theory and so forth. And now so that's hypothesis A. Hypothesis B we'll call the classic binding theory. That's the one that Chomsky first elaborated in the early 1980s in a paper called On Binding in Linguistic Inquiry, and a book that was a series of lectures he gave in Italy in the late 70s called Lectures on Government and Binding Theory. And so the whole thing, in fact, was lectures on government and binding theory. The whole theory was fleshed out with a view to primarily accounting for this stuff, pronominal and reflexive anaphora in English and other languages, and extending that theory to everything else. So everything else started to fall under the same conception of things. In particular, all of these places where we have movement, you have situations where a DP moves somewhere and it binds a trace. That was the terminology that started to be used. And so that's a kind of binding. And the theory of that kind of binding was collapsed with this theory. So that was the beauty of that original thing. But we'll be more explicit here about what exactly being bound means. So two things are said to be bound. A binds B if and only if A and B are co-indexed arguments. That means they have the same value. Their referential value is the same. And we put them in the tree with indices to show that. And they are dominated by some same IP node. Then they are in a situation of binding. So in this case, we have here Kramer knows that Elaine trusts Jerry. Very just completely vanilla, ordinary, embedded clause situation. The co-argument domain for trusts for Elaine and Jerry is that one. And we can put herself in here. Elaine trusts herself, it's fine, right? Because herself can be said to be bound by Elaine. Elaine binds the object of trust slot. Because Elaine is A and herself is B, and they're co-indexed, and they're arguments. They're co-indexed arguments. They're expressions of semantic arguments that are syntactic co-arguments, right? And so we just say they're arguments. And they are dominated by some same IP node, right? They're in the same clause. So we're working that idea of clause mean in here. And that's not okay because here Elaine binds her. Elaine is A, her is B, and so forth, right? And that violates principle B. So you have to be in conformance with these principles at all times. If we we get the reference of him down here, then it's okay, right? Because him is not bound by a co-argument. Right? It's not bound by it's not bound. It gets its reference from something in the higher clause. Himself is not okay here, right? Because it is, because it needs to be, okay, notice how I'm saying this, right? I need a preceding, if I have a co-argument, then I need to be bound by a co-argument that precedes me. Right? I need both of those things to be satisfied in order to be okay. So I'm collapsing things that I put earlier. Okay, so we've got Kramer knows that he trusts Elaine is okay, right? But he in that. So here, this is something new, right? We haven't done that. What goes in that slot? What can go in that slot? Should we be able to put a reflexive in that slot? What does the theory say about that? Given the way it's stated. You know, this is kind of hairy, right? I mean, it's complex, right? The constraints are stated in very in exact terms in order to get the right result. it can be an ordinary pronoun, right? Because it's not bound by a co-argument. It doesn't have a preceding co-argument. But we can't put himself here, right? Himself is no good, and that's okay because himself would have to be bound within the lower clause if it were anywhere, right? But if it doesn't have a co-argument binder, then it can have as its subject, as its antecedent, the closest subject, right? So if we put in, now notice we can put in he himself here, right? What the hell is that? He himself. All of a sudden it's okay, right? And there is no him himself, is there? Bill likes him himself. It's not okay. So in fact, English, it turns out, has some kind of things that are like these self and seg and whatever, that it has a wider variety of things than we had pictured up until now. So what is this thing? It's a nominative pronoun, a nominative reflexive. Because there is no he-self, is there? There is no he-self. Himself could never go. So here's the facts. Himself can never be the subject of an embedded tense clause. Not a possibility, ever. So we've got a situation here where we've got, we don't have any he-self. We don't have any him himself. We only have he himself. And he himself is a compound that goes in one kind of slot. It goes in this slot. Subject of embedded clause, where you need that thing, where you want that thing to be co-referential with something higher up. So because this is not bound, it is, but it's not exactly an ordinary reflexive pronoun. It is one that has to be, it's a long distance version of the reflexive pronoun, right? It wants to have the closest subject or an argument whose point of view is at issue. And it's the version of the reflexive pronoun that goes into that tense clause embedded slot thing here. Okay. Kramer expects Elaine. We have a different situation. Now, all of a sudden we have the subject and the subject of the main clause and the subject of the embedded infinitival clause are now co-arguments, right? So Elaine here has as a co-argument Kramer. In the tense clause situation, no, Kramer is not a co-argument of that position. But in this, we've defined this in such a way that infinitival clauses of this sort have, as their subject, they have it being both a co-argument of the embedded clause and a co-argument of the elements in the upper clause. So we can then get, it's fine to have, it's not okay to have her here, right? Because those are co-arguments. And her would be bound by Elaine. And a pronoun cannot be bound by a co-argument. Herself is okay here because herself and Elaine are co-arguments. And if I'm a reflexive and I have a co-argument, I need to be bound by one preceding me, right? And all of that holds, so we're okay. And him is okay here, right? Because they're not co-arguments, Kramer and him. And himself is not okay because himself has as a co-argument Elaine, and so forth, right? Himself is okay here because these are co-arguments, right? Him is not okay. Because him cannot be, so this all stuff we've gone through, right? That you've got, expects is just a different verb, just like would like, or need, or any of those kinds of raising to object verbs. And then if we get something like this, we get into situations where everything gets very hairy again. And we'll come back to this next time.